Hey, what's up guys, it's BenBonk, and welcome back to the 34th Slimekeep devlog. In this devlog, I added a ton of polish to the game. Also, if you're new here, Slimekeep is a fast-paced roguelike where you must kill and capture slimes to stop the corruption that has infected your land. But without further ado, let's get into it. So actually, before getting into adding polish to the game, I created this Google form where people can apply to be a composer on Slimekeep. I've been thinking about adding music to the game for quite a while now, and I feel like the time has finally come to get started. And after advertising this Google form around, I sifted through all the submissions and finally ended up selecting 3 composers to work on the game. There were so many great submissions, and it was extremely tough to narrow the list down. But eventually I did, and the chosen composers were Lydiac, Splash, and Green Explosion 08. So huge congrats to them, and I'll play a brief snippet of their work here. Trust me, I want to include as many people in this composing process as possible, but at the same time, I want to keep things to just a few composers so the music wouldn't sound too all over the place with different composing styles. So huge thanks to everyone who submitted an application, and I'll keep you guys updated in the next devlog or so on the progress of the music. But for now, let's get started adding some polish to Slimekeep, because I'll admit, the game could really use some. I'm also just starting to get to the point in Slimekeep where I feel like we're sort of closing in on development. Not to say that the game is going to be released anytime soon, but I'm kind of running out of major things to work on, which is a good thing. Anyways, for the first piece of polish I wanted to work on was adding decorations and life to the rooms in Slimekeep. This is something that I've been planning for ages now, because the rooms in Slimekeep look super plain and empty, and you guys have also left hundreds of comments saying how I need to add decorations, so here you go. To start off, I drew up a bunch of different sprites for grass in the game. I then decided to animate all these pieces of grass to give them a bit more life. I just made most pieces kind of sway back and forth or shuffle around. Then I started setting up these pieces of grass in the game and laid them out sporadically in the first set of potential rooms in the game. After doing so, now the player can explore these rooms, and just this change alone seemed to add so much more life to the room. So I went around adding all kinds of different grass pieces to every room in the game, which was an extremely tedious task to say the least. But I wasn't about to stop there. I asked my Discord server if they wanted to help out with some of the decorations, and Beta made these simple flower and mushroom animations, which I thought looked awesome. So I got started on round 2 and worked on adding some of these animations, as well as some extra decorations that I found laying around on my hard drive from a year or 2 ago that a fan made. I'm not completely sure who made these decorations, but if you did, please let me know. Anyways, after adding all these decorations, the game looked even better from before. And I also added this simple little sign decoration for the boat to the Slime King. And you thought we were done here? Nope, because I hopped into Aseprite and made a ton of different item decorations for the rooms. I had the plan of making these items breakable to make things even more satisfying, so I found this item breaking tutorial from Lost Relic Games and started following it by making a bunch of different individual pieces for each breakable decoration. By the end of all that, you can see we have a lot of broken pieces. I then followed the tutorial a bit more and set up the breaking mechanic for these objects. As a test, I had this explosion box, where once the player damages it enough, it'll break into a bunch of different pieces in a really satisfying way. If you're wondering how this system works, essentially I have these objects that look identical to the desired objects to break, but are made up of a bunch of different pieces. Then, when the object breaks, I can instantiate this breakable object and simply add a set amount of torque and force to each individual piece. So with that said, I just went around setting up the breakable object effect for each item that I wanted to be breakable, and ended up with this. As you can see, I can break all these items, which is just super satisfying. Also, some objects take a few hits to break, and I even made a few unique items such as this paper stack which sends papers flying off when damaged. Overall, I'm super happy with how these guys turned out, so let me know what you think. But we still had to actually add these objects into all the rooms in the game, which again was a pretty tedious and boring process as there are over 50 unique rooms in the game. But I got the job done, and here's what the rooms looked like with these new breakable objects. Again, I think it's a huge improvement, and I even added the chance for some items to drop a slime ball or two, which just makes these objects even more satisfying to break. Finally, to wrap up the system, I added in this explosion animation made by Equipped Hats on my Discord server, and made it so this explosion could damage enemies in game. So yeah, that right there is all the new room decorations in the game. Who knows, I could always end up adding even more, but I think this is a great start and a massive visual improvement for the game. Now by this point, we may have been done with all the room decorations, but I still wasn't quite finished with all the polish I wanted to add in the game for now. First up, I added this little pop-up animation for slime enemies once a player enters a room. This may be a pretty subtle and hard to notice effect, but I do think it looks pretty satisfying, and again, it gives the game a bit more juice. I also kept this effect for when a slime upgrades, which is pretty nice in my opinion. Next up, I modified the slime ball move code, so once a player clears a room, the slime balls won't all clump together into one slime ball like they used to, and now the slime balls could sort of move in a pack, which just looks so much better. Moving on, it was now time to work on what might be the most important addition to Slimekeep ever: giving the player the ability to hug the slime pet. You guys have requested this for ages now, so I figured I might as well get to making this. First, I made this hug animation for the player where he magically grows arms. I also made this heart animation and set up some basic logic in Unity. Now, if the player hits the H key, they'll hug the pet. It's nothing crazy, but it's still an addition that I'm really happy with. Next up, I worked on adding a bit of dust when the player starts moving after standing still. It's a subtle effect, but I do think this addition looks quite nice in my opinion, and I also added this dust effect for when slimes jump in the game, just adding that little touch of game juice there. For the next bit of polish, I wanted to update the bullet destroy effect in the game. This is something that's been in the game since Slimekeep was a Game Jam game, and I just think it looks quite terrible as I've never updated it since. So I spent a bit of time trying to rework this particle effect and ended up with this. Now the particles will actually fade out, decrease in size over lifetime, and actually rotate depending on the angle of the bullet impact, creating a satisfying effect. I also spent a bit of time creating a few unique particle effects for different weapons and their projectiles, which really helped to add some variety to the particles. With those changes done, I thought it was a good start, but I still wanted to make weapons a bit more impactful to use. So I created this little camera zoom in shake effect that I think really helps to sell this impact even more. And yeah, that's a few of the weapon changes. Super happy all around. But moving on, I couldn't help but notice that this house sprite in the game looked a little outdated. It's been in the game for ages now, and it was actually made by a fan. Overall, I think it looks pretty nice, but I just don't think it completely fits in with the rest of Slimekeep's art style. So I spent an hour or two transforming the house and ended up with this new modern sprite. Here's what it looked like in game, and overall I would say this is an improvement, but it might be a little much, so let me know what you guys think. Next up, I wanted to work on a bit of polish that I've had in mind for the past few months. This being a visual corruption effect for the game. If you don't know, the more the player plays, the more powerful the Slime King's corruption becomes, making for more difficult enemies. And right now, this effect was just kind of in the background without much visual representation, so I wanted to change that. I started messing around with the game's post-processing effects and imagined the game looking less saturated and more depressing overall as days progressed. So I got to work on the system and set it up. Essentially, I have this function which is called the start of every new day, and it just slightly adds some post-processing effects to the game, such as adding a vignette, some chromatic aberration, and hue shift. Now, in-game, you can see that as the days progress, things start to feel a little more corrupted. It starts off subtle, but as you start getting into the later days in the game, you can really start to see the corruption take shape. Overall, I think this is a pretty nice touch, but I wasn't done just yet. I also had the idea for a particle system as part of the corruption that would play across the screen and ramp up in emission as the days went on. So I got to work on creating this particle system, and in-game, you can see that starting off on around day 1, there aren't many particles flying by. But as I progress the days, these particles start ramping up quite a bit, and eventually these start to become quite noticeable. You might also notice that these particles kind of move with the player, so when the player moves to the right, the particles move faster, and when the player moves to the left, the particles sort of slow down. This was actually a complete accident due to how I made this mechanic, with the particle system being a child of the camera, but I think this effect is pretty neat, so I just left it in. Anyways, moving on from the corruption effect, we still had quite a bit of miscellaneous polishing that I wanted to do. First, I really wanted to rework the weapons UI for the game, as currently it's just quite ugly in my opinion, and is quite outdated from the rest of the UI in the game. So I experimented with removing the dark backgrounds from the weapon UI and messing around with some of the colors of the UI. I then tried adding a kind of dark particle system background, which I thought looked okay. And that's just what I sort of ended up with the new weapons UI. It's not too big of a change, and I'm not 100% sure about it yet, but I do think it's at least somewhat of an improvement and makes the UI look a little cleaner. So let me know what you guys think. Next up, I want to work on a different form of polish for the game, this being what I call break rooms. Essentially, I had the idea to just make a bunch of different rooms that wouldn't contain enemies, and would just be a kind of break or buffer from the usual combat. I imagine making these peaceful rooms, and even having a few rooms with minigames or challenges to spice things up. And I plan to have these rooms spawn every few days or so. So I got to work. For the first break room, I imagine just having a room with a big water fountain. That would just be an overall calm area. I decided to reach out to my Discord server to see if anyone wanted to help by making a fountain for this room, and Host made this really neat fountain sprite. I really like this sprite, but I wasn't sure if it 100% fit the art style for Slimekeep. So I imported it into Aseprite and spent a bit of time reworking some parts just to make it look a little more clean, in my opinion. By the end of that, I ended up with this, and I also ended up making a really basic splash animation for the fountain. After creating a new room and setting the fountain up in game, here's what it looked like. This was a decent start, but I still wasn't fully satisfied with this room. So I made a few additions, most notably being these translucent floor tiles, and improved the fountain animation to make it look like the water is sort of moving down. And I was going to stop there, but then I randomly had the idea to make this fountain be a healing fountain. Super unique idea that's never been done before, I know. But anyways, I modified the fountain a bit so that now the player has the option to walk up to the fountain and drink from it. If they do, there's a pretty good chance they'll be healed to full. However, there is a slight chance that they'll take 3 damage, so it's a little bit of a risk. And there we go, that's the fountain break room. As for the other break rooms, I thought it would be neat just to create a few simple rooms that were just loaded with breakable objects, so I made a few of those to put into the mix. I still have plans to make a few more unique break rooms after this, but that's all I have for this devlog. Make sure to be on the lookout for the next one because I can tell you these next few break rooms are some of my favorite additions to the game I've ever made. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, maybe actually consider subscribing or liking, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.